Part 1. The High Plains Wind and the Empty Cabin. The wind in Montana didn't just blow. It scoured. It was a living thing, born in the high, jagged peaks of the Rockies, and it swept down into the valleys in the winter of 1883 with a voice that sounded like a lonesome god. It stripped the warmth from a man's bones, found every crack in a cabin's chinking, and piled the snow in drifts so high they could swallow a horse whole. In this vast, white wilderness, ranches were islands in an ocean of snow, and men were keepers of lonely lighthouses, their lanterns fueled by coffee and stubbornness. Nate Callahan's ranch, the Hollow Sea, was one of the largest and most prosperous of these islands. It spread across 1,000 acres of prime valley land, a testament to 10 years of relentless work. His cattle were hardy, his fences were strong, and his cabin, built of thick, hand-hewn logs, was a fortress against the wind. From the outside, it was the picture of success. Inside, it was as silent as a tomb. Nate was a man forged by the land he owned, broad-shouldered, quiet, and weathered beyond his 32 years. His face was a map of sun and wind, with lines etched around eyes the color of a winter sky. He had come to Montana with dreams of building a dynasty, a place not just for cattle, but for a family. He'd built the cabin with 2 extra rooms, the floors smooth and waiting for the small, running feet of children. He'd built the barn with stalls for ponies, not just for the powerful quarter horses he bred. He had built it all for Eleanor. But Eleanor was gone. 2 years now, taken by a fever that swept through Helena faster than a prairie fire. She had died with his ring on her finger and her hand in his, her last breath a whisper against the indifferent Montana wind, after he buried her on the small rise overlooking the creek. Something in Nate had shuttered closed. He'd sold off half his herd, dismissed his 2 ranch hands, and retreated into a solitude so profound that the silence in his cabin became a constant, humming companion. His world shrank to the boundaries of his land, his conversations limited to the nickers of his horses and the lowing of his cattle. He worked from before sunrise until long after sunset, using exhaustion as a shield against memory. He was a rich man living a poor man's life, surrounded by the ghosts of what might have been. The Hollow Sea wasn't just the name of his ranch. It was the state of his soul. His only real connection to the man he used to be was through his horses. He had a gift with them, a gentle patience that he no longer afforded to people. His prize was Goliath, a magnificent black stallion with a spirit as wild as the land itself. Goliath was the foal of the first mare he and Eleanor had bought together, a living link to a time when hope felt as real and solid as the earth beneath his boots. The blizzard struck without warning, a solid wall of white that descended from the mountains and blotted out the world. For 2 days and 2 nights, the wind howled like a pack of starving wolves, and Nate did little more than keep the fire fed and make sure his livestock had what they needed in the main barn. On the 3rd morning, the wind finally died, leaving behind a world remade in white and silence. As the pale sun broke through the clouds, Nate strapped on his snowshoes and went to check the damage. The main barn stood fast, but the older, smaller structure, the one he used for his breeding stock, had not fared so well. A massive drift, packed hard as rock by the wind, had put its weight against the northern wall. The great central beam had splintered with a sound he hadn't heard over the storm, and a third of the roof had collapsed inward, a jagged maw of broken timbers and snow. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced the dull ache that usually lived in Nate's chest. Goliath was in that barn. He scrambled through the snow, his heart hammering against his ribs. He clawed his way through the broken doorway and saw it. The stallion was trapped, pinned under a fallen rafter. His powerful body was twisted at an unnatural angle, and one of his hind legs was a mess of splintered wood and blood against the white snow. The horse wasn't screaming. He was just lying there, his great, intelligent eyes wide with terror and pain, his breath coming in ragged, steaming clouds. For the next 6 hours, Nate worked with a feverish intensity he hadn't felt since Eleanor's illness. He used levers and saws, his muscles screaming in protest as he single-handedly fought to free the 1,000-pound animal. The horse, trusting him even in its agony, remained unnervingly still. When at last he pulled the shattered timber away, Nate saw the full extent of the damage. The leg was horribly broken. A clean break might have been manageable, but this was a splintered, mangled ruin. He managed to get the horse onto a makeshift sled and drag him to the warmth and safety of the main barn. He cleaned the wound as best he could, his hands, usually so steady, trembling as he worked. He set the bone, his stomach churning at the grating sound, and wrapped it in splints and clean linen. He gave Goliath water and soft mash, murmuring to him in a low, soothing voice, the words coming easier than they ever did with men. But as he stood back, looking at the animal lying weak and broken in the straw, a deeper, more chilling realization washed over him. He couldn't do this alone. The barn needed to be rebuilt, and soon. Before the next storm hit, Goliath needed constant care, more than one man could provide while also tending to the rest of the ranch. The simple, brutal fact was that his fortress of solitude had been breached. He needed help. The thought was as bitter as gall. Asking for help felt like a betrayal of his grief, an admission that his self-imposed exile wasn't enough. But looking at Goliath, he knew he had no choice. The next day, he rode the 12 miles into the small, dusty settlement of Three Forks. He avoided the gazes of the townsfolk, feeling like a bear coaxed out of hibernation. He went straight to the general store and tacked a small, hand-written notice to the public board. The message was stark, as clipped and functional as the man who wrote it. Help wanted, cleaning cabin, mucking stalls, general labor, daily pay, no questions asked. He didn't specify that he wanted a man. He didn't care who it was, so long as they worked hard and left him be. The last 2 words were the most important. No questions asked. It was a warning as much as a promise. He didn't want to hear a life story, and he damn sure wasn't going to tell his own. This was a transaction of labor for coin, nothing more. He rode home, the silence of the snow-covered landscape pressing in on him. 3 days passed. The silence on the ranch remained unbroken, save for the whisper of the wind and Goliath's pained breathing. Nate began to think no one would come. The notice was too vague, the ranch too remote, his own reputation as a recluse too well known. He was standing in the barn, changing the stallion's dressing, when a shadow fell across the open doorway. He looked up, his hand resting on Goliath's neck. A figure stood silhouetted against the bright, glaring snow. It was a woman, though it was hard to tell at first. She was so thin. The drab wool coat she wore seemed to swallow her whole. A threadbare scarf was wrapped around her head, and her face was pale and drawn, her cheeks hollowed out by hardship. She looked as if the high plains wind might pick her up and carry her away. She took a hesitant step into the barn, her worn-out boots making no sound in the thick straw. Her eyes, the color of moss in deep shade, darted around the cavernous space before settling on him. They were guarded, weary, but there was a stillness in them, an absence of pleading that he found strangely arresting. "Saw your notice in town," she said. Her voice was quiet, raspy from the cold, but clear. "I'm here for the work." Nate straightened up slowly, wiping his hands on his trousers. He was a big man, and he knew he could be intimidating. He was used to it. But this woman didn't flinch. She just stood there, her hands shoved into the pockets of her coat, waiting. He sized her up. She couldn't have weighed more than 100 pounds. The work was hard hauling water, splitting wood, clearing away heavy, snow-laden debris. He had expected a man, or at least a sturdy woman from one of the nearby homesteads. This woman looked like a ghost. "It's hard labor," he said, his voice gruff, "not just sweeping floors." "I'm not afraid of hard labor," she replied, her gaze unwavering. She didn't offer a name. She didn't offer a smile. There was an unnerving lack of ceremony about her. A flicker of something curiosity, maybe or just the strangeness of having another human presence in his space, pricked at him. His own rule, no questions asked, suddenly felt like a challenge. He wanted to ask where she came from, how she'd walked all this way in this cold, why a woman who looked like she needed a hot meal more than a job was seeking out the hardest work she could find. He bit back the questions. A deal was a deal. The collapsed barn needs clearing first, he said, gesturing with his head. Then the stalls in here. My cabin's a mess. Pay is $1 a day. At sundown. It was more than fair pay. Generous, even. He expected her to nod, perhaps even show a flicker of gratitude. She did neither. Her expression remained unchanged, a mask of weary neutrality. Fine, she said, and that was all. What's your name, he asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, just long enough for him to notice. Linda Rock. Nate Callahan, he grunted. An awkward silence fell between them. It was the first time in 2 years a woman other than the storekeeper's wife had stood on his property. The air felt charged with her presence, a quiet disruption to his carefully constructed emptiness. Her stillness was a stark contrast to the howling grief that echoed in his own heart. And yet, he sensed a similar desolation in her. It was in the set of her shoulders, the deep-seated weariness in her eyes. His loneliness, usually a dull background hum, sharpened into a distinct pang. He was a man drowning in solitude, and she was a woman wrapped in a cloak of it. The clash of their two silences filled the space between them, a silent, powerful thing that was both a question and a warning. Part 2. The Woman Who Scrubbed Floors and the Gaze in the Straw. Linda Rock started work without a word. She walked to the collapsed barn, her shoulders set against the biting wind, and stood for a long moment, simply looking. Nate, watching from the doorway of the main barn where he was tending to Goliath, saw not hesitation but assessment. It was the way a carpenter studies a piece of wood before making the first cut. She surveyed the chaos of splintered timbers, heavy snow, and ruined hay, her expression unreadable. Then, she picked up a broken piece of roof plank, tested its weight, and began the slow, methodical process of clearing a path. She worked with a quiet, relentless rhythm that belied her frail frame. There were no wasted movements, no sighs of fatigue, no curses muttered at a stubborn, frozen timber. She moved with a grim efficiency, piling the smaller debris into one area, the larger, salvageable planks into another. Her coat, he noticed, was a patchwork of repairs, the original color lost to sun and time. A seam at the shoulder was held together by mismatched thread, a testament to 100 small battles against poverty. Nate spent the morning with Goliath, changing the dressing on his leg and murmuring to him. But his attention was divided. His gaze kept drifting back to the woman. He saw the way she braced her thin body to shift a heavy beam, using leverage instead of raw strength. He saw her hands, raw and red from the cold, fumbling with a piece of wood before she clenched them and tried again. He owned several pairs of worn leather work gloves in the tack room. An impulse, unfamiliar and insistent, told him to get her a pair. He walked over, holding them out. Here, he said, his voice sounding rusty in the vast silence. These will help. She stopped, a piece of shattered wood in her hands, and looked first at the gloves, then at his face. Her moss-green eyes were guarded, searching. For a second, he thought she would refuse. Her pride seemed to be a tangible thing, a shield she held up against the world. Thank you, Mr. Callahan, she said, her voice low. She took the gloves, her cold fingers brushing his for a fleeting instant. The contact was like a spark of static in the frozen air. She pulled them on. They were ridiculously large on her small hands. But she flexed her fingers inside them and immediately went back to work, the gesture of acceptance serving as a dismissal. He returned to Goliath, feeling strangely rebuffed. He had offered a simple kindness, yet it felt as if she had taken it on her own terms, stripping it of any charity and reducing it to a practical matter of tools for a job. As the morning wore on, his initial skepticism about her ability to handle the work faded, replaced by a grudging respect. The woman was tougher than she looked. She was tougher than most men he'd hired. By midday, she had cleared a significant portion of the collapsed barn, her breathing now visible in ragged white puffs. But her pace never slackened. Nate went inside his cabin and put a pot of coffee on the stove. He cut thick slices of bread and pulled a piece of smoked venison from the larder. The cabin was cold and smelled of stale wood smoke and loneliness. He was used to eating alone, standing over the counter. But today, the silence felt different. It was amplified by the knowledge of her presence just 100 yards away. It felt wrong, somehow, to eat in the warmth of his cabin while she worked in the bitter cold. He poured a steaming mug of coffee and put the bread and meat on a plate. When he stepped back outside, he found her sitting on an overturned water bucket, her back straight, staring out at the snow-covered mountains. She was not eating. She was not resting. She was simply being still, gathering herself. The big leather gloves lay beside her. Her bare hands were tucked under her arms for warmth. "Brought you something," he said, holding out the plate and mug. She turned her head. Her eyes fell on the food, and for the briefest of moments, a flicker of raw hunger, sharp and desperate, crossed her face. It was there and gone so fast he almost thought he'd imagined it. Her expression hardened back into its neutral mask. "No, thank you," she said. "You have to eat," he insisted, taking a step closer. "It's part of the day's pay if you want." She stood up, her small stature somehow commanding. Her gaze met his, and there was no deference in it, no gratitude, only a fierce, unyielding pride that seemed to hold her thin body erect. "I need the work, Mr. Callahan. I don't need charity." The words were spoken quietly, without anger, but they hit him with the force of a physical blow. He felt a flush of irritation, and beneath it, something like shame. He had seen himself as being kind, but she saw it as pity. And maybe she was right. Maybe he was trying to ease his own discomfort at the sight of her hardship. "It's not charity," he said, his tone harsher than he intended. "It's just coffee." "I'll get back to work," she said, pulling on the gloves and turning her back on him and his offering. He stood there for a long moment, the plate growing heavy in his hand, the steam from the coffee cup dissipating into the cold air. He felt like a fool. He took the food back inside, his appetite gone, and watched her through the window. She worked through the noon hour without stopping. By late afternoon, she had finished clearing the debris. She moved on to the main barn, taking up a pitchfork to muck out the stalls. The work was filthy and physically demanding, yet she did it with the same quiet thoroughness. She scraped the floors clean, laid down fresh, sweet-smelling straw, and filled the water troughs. The barn, which had been neglected in his solitary state, began to look and smell clean for the first time in months. She worked around him and the injured Goliath with a quiet grace, her presence a constant, silent reproach to his own inertia. He began to notice the small things, the way her patched coat couldn't quite keep out the wind that whipped through the barn, the thinness of her neck above the worn collar, and always, her hands. When she took the gloves off to work the latch on a feed bin, he saw they were chapped to the point of cracking, the knuckles swollen and red. They were the hands of someone who had known nothing but hard labor, yet they moved with a certain delicacy. They were hands that had been broken by life but refused to stop working. They were a symbol of her entire being, damaged but deeply dignified. As the sun began to dip below the mountains, painting the snow in shades of orange and purple, she moved to the final task, his cabin. He felt a strange vulnerability as he watched her cross the yard. The barns were workspaces, impersonal. The cabin was his refuge. the place where his grief lived and breathed in the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams. She stepped inside, and the small space seemed to shrink around her quiet presence. She started in the main room, sweeping the floor with firm, even strokes. She gathered the scattered newspapers and stacked them neatly. She took a damp rag and began to wipe down the thick layer of dust that coated every surface. When she reached the stone mantelpiece above the hearth, she paused. Her fingers, gentle now, traced the outline of a silver frame holding a photograph of a smiling young woman with bright, hopeful eyes. Eleanor. Nate's throat tightened. He expected Linda to look at him, to offer a word of sympathy, to ask who the woman was. It's what anyone else would have done. But she didn't. She simply cleaned the dust from the glass with meticulous care, her face betraying no emotion, and set the photograph back in its place, perfectly centered. She granted his memories the same impersonal respect she gave his furniture. In that moment, his admiration for her deepened into something more complex, something he couldn't name. She was cleaning his house, but it felt as if she were tidying up the messy corners of his life, not by intruding, but simply by imposing order on the chaos around him. She worked until the last of the light faded from the sky. When she was done, the cabin was transformed. The floors were clean, the single window was washed and clear, and a fire was laid in the hearth, ready to be lit. The air felt lighter, cleaner. She found him in the barn, giving Goliath fresh water. She didn't speak, just stood in the doorway, her work for the day complete. The silence stretched, filled only by the soft sounds of the horse. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver dollar. He held it out to her. As she took it, her cold, chapped fingers brushed against his palm. The touch was fleeting, accidental, but it sent a jolt through him. It was the first human touch he'd truly registered in 2 years. "Be here at sunrise?" he asked. She nodded once, her gaze direct in the lantern light. "I'll be here." She tucked the coin deep into a pocket of her worn coat and turned to leave. He watched her walk out of the warm circle of lantern light and into the deepening twilight. He followed her to the main door of the barn and stood there, watching her small figure move across the snow-covered yard. She walked past the cleared debris of the collapsed barn, past his silent cabin, and toward the dark, imposing line of the forest that bordered his property. She didn't look back. She just kept walking, her steps steady and sure, until the trees swallowed her whole. The wind picked up, moaning through the eaves of the barn, and for the first time, it didn't sound like the voice of a lonesome god. It sounded like the voice of his own profound, aching loneliness. The silence she left behind was heavier than the one he had cultivated for 2 years. His old silence had been a thick blanket of grief. This new silence was a hollow, empty space, shaped exactly like her. He stood in the doorway for a long time, staring at the spot where she had disappeared, a cold, unfamiliar emptiness blooming in his chest. Part 3. You pay me to clean your cabin, not to stay in it. A week bled into 2, and a strange, unspoken rhythm established itself at the Hollow Sea Ranch. Linda Rock would appear as the first pale light of dawn touched the snow-swept peaks, a silent specter materializing from the edge of the forest. She would work all day with that same tireless, grim determination, and as the last rays of sun bled from the sky, she would take her silver dollar and disappear back into the trees. She never spoke unless spoken to, and her answers were always clipped, functional, offering no purchase for conversation. She had finished rebuilding the collapsed barn. Nate had watched, astonished, as she'd handled the hammer and saw with an expertise that spoke of long, hard experience. She set the new support beams herself, refusing his help with a curt shake of her head, her body a study in grim perseverance as she hoisted the heavy timbers into place. The structure she built was not elegant, but it was solid, strong, and true, much like the woman herself. Her presence had become a fixture in his landscape, as much a part of his day as the rising sun and the lowing of his cattle. He found himself watching her constantly. He watched the way the wind whipped strands of her dull brown hair from her scarf, revealing the sharp, delicate line of her jaw. He watched the set of her shoulders as she carried 2 heavy buckets of water from the well, a load that should have staggered her. He learned the map of her poverty, the worn-out soles of her boots that she'd tried to patch with a piece of leather, the way she would sometimes pause and press a hand to her lower back, her face tight with a pain she refused to acknowledge. The cold deepened. A new front moved in, bringing with it a wind that had teeth. Nate would sit in his warm cabin at night, the fire roaring, and think of her solitary walk through the darkening, wolf-haunted woods. The thought gnawed at him. His ranch had a small line shack about a mile from the main cabin, built for cowhands checking the herds in summer. It was crude, just a single room with a bunk and a small wood stove, but it was dry and secure. One afternoon, as she was finishing her work, he approached her. "The weather's turning," he said, his words sounding clumsy and loud in the quiet barn. "There's a spare cabin up the north pasture. It's got a stove. You could stay there. Save you the walk." He tried to make the offer sound practical, a simple matter of convenience. But as soon as the words were out, he knew they sounded like what they were, an act of pity. Linda stopped sweeping and turned to face him. She held the broom handle in her chapped hands. Her knuckles white, her moss-green eyes were flat, impenetrable. "No, thank you, Mr. Callahan," she said. "It's no trouble." He pressed, feeling a strange desperation. "The place is empty. Better someone uses it than it just sits there." "I have a place," she stated simply. "This would be safer," he insisted. "Warmer." A flicker of something hard and cold entered her eyes. "You pay me to clean your cabin, Mr. Callahan," she said, her voice dropping to a low, intense whisper. "You don't pay me to stay in it." The words drew a line in the sand so clear and sharp it stunned him into silence. She was not his responsibility. She was his employee. The silver dollar at the end of the day was the beginning and the end of their arrangement. She turned back to her sweeping. The rhythmic scrape of the broom against the wood floor, the only sound. The conversation was over. That night, the failure of his offer festered in him. Her pride was a fortress, and he couldn't find a way inside. His concern was real, but now, alone in the oppressive silence of his home, he was forced to examine it more closely. He looked at the empty chair across the hearth, the one Eleanor would have sat in. He looked at the dust-free mantel, the gleaming floorboards. Linda's labor had brought order to his house, but her presence had brought a deeper disorder to his soul. It had woken him up to the crushing depth of his own loneliness. Was his concern for her truly selfless, or was he trying to keep her close, a small flame of human life to ward off his own darkness? Was he offering her shelter from the cold, or was he offering himself shelter from the silence? The questions were unsettling. He realized, with a jolt of shame, that he was using her plight to make himself feel needed, to feel like something more than a ghost rattling around an empty ranch. And she, with her fierce, quiet dignity, had refused to be a part of it. He couldn't force her to accept his help, but he couldn't stand by and do nothing, either. He decided on a different tactic: deception. The next evening, before she left, he went to his larder. He filled a burlap sack with a 5-pound bag of flour, a slab of smoked bacon, a small bag of coffee beans, and a tin of molasses. It was a king's ransom for someone living on the edge of starvation. He carried the sack to the newly rebuilt section of the barn. He tucked it behind a stack of hay bales. In a corner she would have to pass on her way out. He made it look as if it had been left there by mistake, a forgotten bundle of supplies. He told himself it wasn't charity if she just found it. He watched from his window as she finished her work, took her dollar, and walked toward the barn exit. He saw her pause near the hay bales. She stood still for a full minute. He couldn't see her expression. Then, she picked up the sack, slung it over her shoulder with an effort that made her stagger slightly, and walked out into the twilight without a backward glance. A profound sense of relief washed over him. He had won. He had found a way past her pride. He slept better that night than he had in months. He was wrong. The next morning, she arrived at the usual time. He was in the barn, checking on Goliath. The stallion's leg was healing slowly but cleanly, a small victory in his static life. Linda walked past him and set to her work without a word. Her face was as impassive as ever, but there was a new tension in the air, a brittle quality to the silence. He waited, but she said nothing. After an hour, his curiosity got the better of him. He went to the corner where he'd left the sack. It was empty, but lying on the hay was a folded piece of rough brown paper, torn from a feed sack. He picked it up, scrawled in charcoal. In a surprisingly neat hand were 6 words. "I don't need charity. I work to live." Beneath the words, stacked carefully, were 4 silver dollars. 4 days' wages. She was paying him back. He stood there, staring at the charcoal words, feeling as if she had slapped him. The sheer, unbreakable force of her will was staggering. She would rather go hungry, would rather walk through a blizzard, than be indebted to anyone. She had taken his gift, carried its weight all the way to wherever she called home, and then carried its value all the way back to throw at his feet. He closed his hand around the coins, their cold weight a rebuke in his palm. All his assumptions, all his clumsy attempts to help, felt arrogant and foolish. He was Nate Callahan, a man who owned 1,000 acres, a man who could buy and sell most of the people in Three Forks. He had paid her to clean his cabin, but he had no idea who she was. He spent the rest of the day in a state of turmoil. The internal conflict was no longer a quiet question, but a roaring debate. His desire to help her was now hopelessly entangled with a desperate, consuming need to understand her. Who was this woman? What life had forged such pride? What secrets did she protect with such fierce silence? The mystery of Linda Rock had become the first vital, living thing to take root in his desolate heart since Eleanor's death. It was a painful, obsessive bloom. He had offered her shelter, food, kindness, and she had rejected it all. She wanted nothing from him but the work and the wage. As the sun began its slow descent, casting long, blue shadows across the snow, a new resolve hardened within him. He had honored her boundaries. He had played by her rules, but the rules no longer worked for him. The questions were too loud. He had to know. When she came to him in the barn for her pay, the air between them was thick with unspoken things. He placed the silver dollar in her hand, his fingers brushing hers. This time, she pulled her hand back as if burned. "I'll see you in the morning. Mr. Callahan," she said, her voice a little too quiet. "Linda," he said, the name feeling strange on his tongue. She stopped but didn't turn around. He didn't know what to say. "Don't go. It's too cold. Let me help you." The words died in his throat. He had already tried. She waited a moment longer, then walked away. He watched her cross the yard, a small, solitary figure against the vast, indifferent landscape. He watched her until she reached the edge of the forest and, without hesitation, stepped into the deep, gathering shadows. But this time, he didn't turn back to the empty warmth of his cabin. A millionaire rancher had paid her to clean his cabin, a simple transaction. But as he followed her home, walking not to his house but to the stable, he knew it had become something else entirely. He saddled his quietest mare, her hooves making soft thuds in the straw. He was crossing a line, breaking the one rule no questions asked that had brought her to him. He didn't care anymore. He swung himself into the saddle and urged the mare forward, following the lonely set of tracks that led into the woods, into the twilight, and into the heart of a mystery he could no longer live with. Part 4. 4 children and the flame in the ruined shack. The forest closed in around Nate as he rode, the dense stands of pine and fir swallowing the last of the evening light. A deep, primal silence settled over the woods. broken only by the soft crunch of his mare's hooves in the snow and the whisper of the wind in the high branches. He felt like a trespasser, a profaner of a sanctuary he had no right to enter. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of an unseen creature, felt like an accusation. He was violating the one simple contract they had no questions asked. Yet, an invisible cord pulled him forward. The line of Linda's solitary tracks, a question he could no longer leave unanswered. He rode for what felt like well over a mile. Then, too, the sheer distance she walked, twice a day, in the biting cold, began to sink in. She was not walking from a nearby homestead. She was coming from the deep woods, from the wild, unclaimed land that bordered his own. The tracks led him away from any recognizable trail, through thickets of alder and across a frozen creek that glittered like a vein of silver in the moonlight. He was a man who knew this land, yet he had never been this deep into its forgotten corners. He smelled it before he saw it, the faint, sweet scent of pine smoke on the frigid air. It was a fragile scent, almost lost in the vastness of the forest. He slowed the mare to a walk, his senses on high alert. A few hundred yards further, he saw a light. It wasn't the steady, welcoming glow of a lantern in a proper cabin window. It was a weak, flickering orange, a tiny spark of life held cupped in the hands of a great darkness. He dismounted, tethering the mare to a low-hanging branch where she would be hidden from view. He moved forward on foot, his boots sinking into the deep snow, his steps as silent as a predator's. The shack, when he finally saw it clearly, stopped him in his tracks. It was less a building and more an act of sheer desperation. It was a hovel, cobbled together from scavenged logs, scrap timber, and hope. The walls were uneven, the gaps chinked with a mixture of mud and moss that was already crumbling in the frost. The roof sagged dangerously in the middle, and the single window was a patchwork of oiled parchment and a tattered piece of canvas, glowing from the meager light within. It was a place built not to live in, but merely to survive in. A wave of cold dread washed over Nate, a feeling wholly separate from the freezing air. This was where she went. This was the place she had spoken of with such finality. His offer of the line shack, which he had considered humble, now seemed like an offer of a palace. He crept closer, his heart hammering against his ribs. He felt a profound sense of shame at his intrusion, but the need to see, to understand, was a fire in his gut. He found a spot at the edge of the small, trampled clearing, partially hidden by the drooping boughs of a snow-laden spruce. From here, he could see through a tear in the canvas covering the window. He peered inside, and the world shifted on its axis. The interior was a single, small room, bare and brutally poor. There was no furniture to speak of, save for a few wooden crates and a thin mattress of straw and old blankets in one corner. The floor was packed earth, but that is not what Nate saw. His eyes were fixed on the scene unfolding in the center of the room, illuminated by the warm, dancing light of a small fire in a crude stone hearth. Huddled on a threadbare rug before the flames were 4 children. He saw a girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, with her mother's serious eyes and a long brown braid hanging down her back. She was carefully feeding small twigs into the fire, her movements responsible and practiced. Near her, 2 small boys, identical as 2 chestnuts and no older than 5 or 6, were playing a quiet game with carved pieces of wood. They were thin, their patched clothes too small for them, but their faces were animated with the simple, pure joy of childhood. And in Linda's arms, wrapped in a bundle of what looked like old flour sacks, was a baby. Nate's breath caught in his throat. He felt the air leave his lungs in a silent rush, as if he'd been punched. He stared, unable to process the scene. This was her secret. This was the reason for the walls, the silence, the ferocious, unbreakable pride. The Linda he saw through that window was not the woman he knew. The hard, weary mask she wore at his ranch was gone. Here, in the warm glow of the fire, her face was soft, transformed. She rocked the infant in her arms, a gentle smile touching her lips as she looked down at the tiny, sleeping face. She murmured something to the boys, and her voice, which he had only ever heard in clipped, toneless monosyllables, was a soft, warm melody. He saw her reach out and gently brush a stray piece of hair from the older girl's forehead. It was a gesture of such tenderness, such profound love, that it struck Nate to the core. The scene was a portrait of brutal contrasts. The abject poverty of the shack screamed of hardship and hunger. The wind moaning outside promised a merciless winter. But inside that tiny, fragile circle of firelight was a wealth he hadn't known existed. There was warmth. There was safety. There was a fierce, defiant love that burned brighter than any fire. A storm of emotions crashed over him. First came a wave of pure, unadulterated shock that left him dizzy. 4 children, all this time. She had been fighting not just for herself, but for them. Every swing of the hammer, every splinter in her hand, every dollar she earned was for them. Then came the shame, hot and suffocating. He thought of his clumsy attempts at charity. The offer of the line shack, how could he have been so blind she could never have left them? He thought of the sack of food, his secret, arrogant gift. He had imagined her eating it alone, and the thought had given him comfort. The reality was that it would have been a single meal for 5 hungry people. Her returning the wages was not just an act of pride. It was an act of defiance. She was telling him she would provide for her own, on her own terms, without his pity. His own life, his own grief, which he had nurtured in his vast, empty cabin, suddenly seemed like a shameful indulgence. He had the luxury of solitude, the wealth to retreat from the world and mourn. Linda Rock had no such luxury. She could not afford to be weak. She could not afford to be sad. She could not afford to be anything less than a fortress for the 4 small lives that depended on her. His respect for her, already deep, now fractured and reformed into something else entirely, a profound, humbling awe. He was not looking at a poor, desperate woman. He was looking at a warrior, a queen defending a tiny, besieged kingdom of love against the entire, indifferent world. He, Nate Callahan, with all his land and his money, was the pauper. She, in her ruined shack with her hungry children, was the one who was truly rich. A snowflake landed on his cheek, cold and wet, startling him from his reverie. Then another and another. A light snow had begun to fall, dusting the dark trees with a fresh coat of white. It was a sign. He had seen what he needed to see. To stay any longer would be to desecrate the sacred space he had stumbled upon. He backed away from the window, his movements slow and careful. He retreated into the shadows of the spruce trees, his heart a painful, aching knot in his chest. He turned and walked back to his horse. The image of Linda's smiling face, of the children by the fire, burned into his mind. The ride back to the hollow sea was a journey through a changed world. The forest no longer felt menacing. The cold no longer seemed to bite so deep. His own fortress of a cabin, when he finally saw its dark shape against the snow, looked different. It looked vast, opulent, and obscenely empty. He unsaddled the mare, his hands moving automatically, his mind miles away in a dilapidated shack in the woods. He walked into his home, the clean floors and tidy surfaces a testament to her hard work, but the order she had brought to his house was nothing compared to the chaos she had unleashed in his soul. He stood in the middle of the silent room. The ghosts of his own might-have-been family swirling around him. The life he had mourned was one of comfortable dreams. The life she was living was one of brutal, beautiful reality. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he could not walk away. He could not unsee what he had seen. He couldn't let that small, defiant flame in the woods be extinguished by the coming winter. But how could he help a woman who would rather starve than accept a handout? How could he offer aid without wounding the very pride that kept her and her children alive? He did not have the answers, but as he stood there, alone in his echoing house, He knew he had found something to live for besides a memory. He had found a reason to fight. Part 5. The Storm and the Open Door. The day after, Nate discovered her secret. Linda arrived at the ranch as usual. The sun was bright on the snow. The air was still and deceptively mild. But Nate could feel a change in the sky. A strange, yellowish light rimmed the horizon, and the mountains seemed too close, too sharp, as if cut from steel. It was the kind of calm that came before a war. He watched her work, his new knowledge a heavy weight in his chest. Every move she made was now cast in a different light. Her silence was not coldness, it was a shield. Her thinness was not frailty, it was the result of a mother's sacrifice, of meals given to small mouths instead of her own. He saw the faint, violet shadows under her eyes and understood they came from sleepless nights spent listening to a baby's cry or a child's cough. He felt an almost unbearable urge to speak, to tell her he knew, to offer help in a way that would not wound her, but the words wouldn't come. What could he say? I invaded your privacy and unearthed the secret you have fought so hard to protect. So he remained silent, and the space between them filled with a new, unspoken tension. By midday, the sky had turned a bruised, ugly gray. The wind began to rise, not with its usual steady moan, but in violent, shrieking gusts that rattled the windows of the cabin and sent plumes of snow swirling like angry ghosts across the yard. Linda kept working, her movements becoming faster, more urgent, as if she were racing the coming storm. You should go home, Nate said, his voice loud over the rising wind. It's going to be a bad one. She looked up at the sky, her face tight with a worry she could no longer hide. I'll finish this first. Leave it, he commanded, his tone sharper than he intended. He thrust the day's wage into her hand. Go, now! For once, she did not argue. She gave a single grateful nod and practically ran toward the forest, pulling her thin scarf tighter around her head. Nate stood in the barn doorway and watched her until she was gone, a profound sense of dread coiling in his gut. That shack was a tinderbox, a thing of sticks and mud. It would not survive this. For the next 2 hours, he tried to work. He tended to Goliath, checked on his cattle, and battened down every loose shutter and door on the ranch. But his mind wasn't on his tasks. It was 2 miles away, in a ruined hovel with a sagging roof. With every escalating shriek of the wind, the image of the 4 children huddled by their tiny fire grew more vivid, more terrifying. The storm was no longer just weather. It was a living, breathing monster, and it was stalking them. By nightfall, the blizzard hit with the force of a locomotive. The snow came down not in flakes, but in a solid, blinding curtain of white. The wind was a physical presence, a battering ram that shook the thick log walls of his cabin. He stoked the fire in his hearth until it roared, the flames a stark contrast to the white fury outside. The cabin was a bastion of warmth and safety, a fortress of solitude he had built for himself. And tonight, it felt like a prison. He paced the floor, from the window to the hearth, the length of the room a measure of his helplessness. He thought of the roof on that shack, already sagging under the old snow. He imagined the wind finding the cracks in the walls, the cold seeping in, the children crying. The guilt was a physical pain. He was here, safe and warm, with a larder full of food, while they were out there, fighting for their lives against a monster. His self-imposed isolation, once a comfort, was now a form of cowardice. He could not stand it. He could not sit by his fire, safe and alone, while they faced the storm. The question of her pride, of how to help without offending her, was a luxury he could no longer afford. Survival was the only thing that mattered now. In a sudden, decisive movement, he strode to the back room and pulled on his heaviest coat, a thick sheepskin he hadn't worn in years. He wrapped a scarf around his face, pulled on his gloves, and grabbed the lantern. He fought his way to the barn, the wind tearing at him, the snow so deep it was already past his knees. He saddled Zeus, his strongest and steadiest gelding, a powerful buckskin who was afraid of nothing. The horse whinnied nervously. Sensing the violence in the air, Nate calmed him with a steady hand and a low voice, his own fear giving way to a cold, clear purpose. He tied a thick rope to the saddle horn and looped a heavy wool blanket over the back. Riding into the blizzard was like riding into a churning sea of milk. The world was gone, erased. There was no up, no down, no direction, only the deafening roar of the wind and the stinging, relentless assault of the snow. The lantern cast a pathetic, flickering glow that barely illuminated the horse's ears. He could not see the tracks from the day before. They were long buried. He had only his memory of the path and a rancher's instinct to guide him. It was a nightmare journey. Branches, heavy with snow and invisible in the whiteout, clawed at his face. The horse stumbled twice, its hooves sinking into hidden drifts. But each time it righted itself. Nate bent low over the horse's neck, shielding his face, his mind fixed on a single image, a tiny, glowing window in the heart of the forest. He talked to the horse, to himself, to God. His words ripped away by the wind as soon as they left his lips. After what felt like an eternity, a lifetime of fighting the storm, he smelled it again, faint, almost lost, but there. Wood smoke. He urged Zeus forward, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and terror. And then he saw it. The shack, or what was left of it. His worst fears had been realized, and then exceeded. The sagging roof had given way completely. A massive pile of snow, broken timbers, and torn canvas lay in a heap where the center of the room should have been. The storm was pouring directly into the hovel. He threw himself from the saddle and plunged through the snow, shouting Linda's name. He ripped away the broken remains of the door and staggered inside. The scene was one of utter desolation. The fire in the hearth was nearly extinguished, a few pathetic embers hissing as snowflakes melted on them. In the one corner of the room that still had a piece of roof over it, Linda was crouched on the floor. She had wrapped the 3 older children in the one thin mattress, and she was holding the baby against her chest, her own body curled around them all, a human shield against the wind and snow. Nal, the eldest girl, was crying silently, her small body trembling. The boys were rigid with cold, their faces pale in the gloom. Linda looked up as he burst in, her eyes wide with shock and a raw, primal fear. Her face was smudged with soot, her hair wild. She looked like a cornered animal, ready to fight to the death. There was no time for words. Nate strode forward. "I'm getting you out of here!" He yelled over the storm. He expected her to protest, to fight him, but her strength was gone. She had fought her battle alone, and she had lost. All that was left was a mother's terror. She could only nod, a single, jerky movement. He worked quickly. He took the bundled infant from her arms. The baby, Ruth, was terrifyingly still and cold to the touch. He unbuttoned his own thick sheepskin coat, placed the baby against his chest for warmth, and buttoned it back up. He turned to the others. Leo and Tom, the 2 little boys, were frozen with fear. He lifted them, one under each arm. They were as light as kindling. "Come on," he said to Nal, his voice gentle but firm. "You have to be brave." The little girl looked from him to her mother, then wiped her eyes with a frozen hand and stood up. Nate led them out into the blizzard, shielding them with his body. He placed the boys on the saddle in front of him and had Nal hold on tight behind them. He handed the reins to Linda. "Get them to the ranch," he commanded. "Follow the horse's tracks back. I'll be right behind you with the baby." But she shook her head, her eyes wild. "We all go together." He understood. She would not be separated from them. He looked at the horse, then at the small family. It was impossible, but he had to make it possible. He repositioned the children, placing the 2 boys together in the saddle, their small bodies clinging to the horn. He lifted Nala and sat her behind them. He took the baby from his coat and handed her to Linda. "Hold her tight," he said. He then lifted Linda and placed her on the horse's broad back, behind her children. He gave her the blanket. "Wrap it around all of you." He took Zeus's bridle in his hand. "Hold on," he said, and began to lead them, on foot, back into the heart of the storm. The journey back was a slow, agonizing crawl. Nate walked ahead, breaking a path through the snow. Every step a monumental effort. He was the anchor, the engine, the sheer force of will that pulled 5 other lives from the teeth of the blizzard. When the warm, yellow light of his own cabin finally appeared through the swirling snow, it was the most beautiful sight he had ever seen. He practically carried them inside, into the overwhelming mercy of the warmth. He slammed the door, shutting out the storm, and for a moment, they all just stood there, breathing in the warm air, the sudden silence deafening. He slid the children from the horse and brought them inside. He stripped off their wet, frozen clothes and wrapped each of them in thick wool blankets from his bed. He sat them on the rug before the hearth and added more logs to the fire until it blazed, casting a warm, golden glow over everything. He found milk and heated it on the stove, adding a spoonful of precious sugar. The children, their fear slowly melting away, drank the sweet, hot milk, their eyes huge and dark. One by one, their heads began to nod. Soon, all 4 of them were asleep, a pile of exhausted, rescued children, their breath fogging in the warm air, safe on his floor. Nate sank into the chair opposite the fire, every muscle in his body aching with an exhaustion so deep it felt like it was in his bones. Linda was huddled on the floor by her children, watching them sleep. She hadn't said a word. She just watched them, her hands stroking a damp head here, tucking a blanket there, assuring herself they were real, they were warm, they were alive. The storm raged outside, a wild, impotent beast clawing at the walls, but inside, there was a profound peace. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the soft, rhythmic breathing of sleeping children. Finally, Linda looked up at him, her face illuminated by the firelight. The mask was gone. Her eyes were raw, vulnerable, stripped of all her pride. "Why?" she whispered, her voice husky. "Why did you do this?" Nate looked at her, at the fierce, exhausted mother. He looked at the children sleeping on his hearth, filling his empty home with life. He thought of the lonely, bitter man he had been just weeks ago. "Because," he said, his voice quiet but clear over the sound of the wind, "no one should have to fight a storm alone." Part 6. The Ghost of the Past. Raymond's Return. The blizzard broke, leaving behind a world scoured clean and dazzlingly white. In its wake, a fragile peace settled over the Hollow Sea Ranch. The storm had not just broken Linda's shack. It had shattered the walls she had built around herself and the solitude Nate had curated for 2 years. His cabin, once a silent monument to grief, was now filled with the small, chaotic sounds of life. The children, after their initial shyness, began to thaw in the steady warmth of the hearth. The 2 boys, Leo and Tom, discovered the wonder of a wooden floor perfect for sliding on in their socks. Nal, with her mother's serious eyes, appointed herself Nate's solemn assistant, following him to the barn and asking quiet, intelligent questions about the horses. And little Ruth, the infant, would lie swaddled in a blanket in a repurposed crate near the fire, her soft gurgles a constant, gentle melody. Linda moved through this new reality like a ghost learning to be solid again. The hard, defensive mask was gone, replaced by a quiet watchfulness. She refused to be idle. She cooked meals for them all, simple, hearty stews that filled the cabin with the scent of home. She mended Nate's clothes with neat, practiced stitches. She cared for her children with a fierce, tender devotion that humbled him every time he witnessed it. But a shadow of fear remained in her eyes. She lived on a precipice, as if waiting for the other shoe to drop, for this impossible sanctuary to be snatched away. Nate found himself a stranger in his own life. He had spent 2 years avoiding feeling anything, and now he felt everything. He felt a fierce protectiveness for the small family that had washed up on his shore. He felt a growing admiration for Linda's resilience that was slowly, terrifyingly, beginning to feel like something deeper. He felt the hollow places in his heart being filled not by a replacement for his old love, but by the burgeoning of a new one, green and tentative as the first shoots of spring under the snow. They existed in this unspoken truce for nearly 2 weeks. The outside world ceased to exist. Their universe was the cabin, the barn, and the vast, silent expanse of white. It was a cold, bright afternoon when that universe was invaded. Nate was in the barn, working with Goliath. The stallion's leg was healing well, and he was finally able to put a little weight on it. Nala was with him, carefully brushing the horse's black coat. Linda was in the cabin with the younger children. It was a peaceful, domestic scene, the kind he had once dreamed of and then abandoned. The sound of approaching riders made him look up. It wasn't the slow, plodding gait of a neighbor's workhorse. It was the confident, aggressive beat of 3 horses being pushed hard. He felt a premonitory tightening in his gut. He put a hand on Nal's shoulder. "Go inside, sweetheart," he said, his voice low and calm. "Tell your mother to lock the door and stay away from the window." The girl's eyes widened with a fear that was far too old for her years. She nodded and ran, her small legs churning through the snow. Nate stepped to the barn door and watched them ride into his yard. The man in the lead was tall and wiry, with a handsome, dissolute face that was marred by a sneering mouth and a pair of cold, restless eyes. He wore a flashy coat and a gambler's hat, both of which looked out of place in the honest grit of a working ranch. The 2 men who flanked him were cut from a rougher cloth hired muscle, their faces hard and their eyes empty. Nate knew, with a certainty that was cold as ice in his veins, who he was looking at. This was the ghost from Linda's past. The man swung down from his horse, his movements arrogant. He didn't look at Nate. His eyes scanned the property, lingering on the cabin, a proprietary smirk on his lips. "Quite the spread you got here. Callahan," the man said, his voice laced with a false congeniality that made the hairs on Nate's neck stand up. "Heard you were looking for help. Seems you found some—" Nate moved out of the barn and planted himself in the middle of the yard, halfway between the riders and the cabin door. He was a bigger man than all 3 of them, and he let his size speak for itself. He kept his hands loose at his sides, his posture relaxed but ready. "State your business," Nate said. His voice was flat, a low rumble that carried a clear warning. The man finally turned his cold eyes on Nate. "My business, I've come for my property, a woman named Linda, and my 4 children." He said the word children as if it were an asset, a piece of livestock to be reclaimed. Name's Raymond Stone, Linda's husband. Nate felt a surge of pure, white-hot rage. This was the man who had driven her to that hovel in the woods. This was the source of the fear that haunted her eyes. "She's not your property," Nate said, his voice dangerously quiet. "And you're not her husband." Raymond laughed. "A short, ugly bark. The law says different. I got papers. Now, I'm a reasonable man. She ran off with some money of mine. Just give me what I'm owed, and the brats, and I'll be on my way. We can forget this whole thing." The cabin door opened a crack. Linda stood there, her face a mask of stark terror. She looked from Raymond to Nate, her hand flying to her mouth. Raymond's sneer widened. "There she is. Linda. Honey, stop hiding behind this farmer and come on out. We've got family business to discuss." Linda shrank back, pulling the door almost shut. Nate took a step, placing himself more squarely in Raymond's line of sight, blocking the view of the cabin. "You heard me," Raymond snapped, his thin veneer of charm vanishing. "Send her and the kids out, now." One of his men dismounted, a hand resting casually on the butt of the pistol holstered at his hip. The threat was no longer veiled. "You're not welcome here," Nate said, his gaze fixed on Raymond. "Get on your horses and ride out." "I'm not leaving without what's mine," Raymond snarled, his face twisting with fury. He took a step toward the cabin. Nate moved to block him, planting his feet like ancient oaks. He was a wall of quiet, immovable force. He stood directly in front of the cabin door, a guardian at the gate. "You're not taking anyone," Nate said, his voice low and resonant with a power that came from the very land he stood on. Not for money, not for anything. For a moment, they were frozen in a tableau of confrontation, the sneering gambler, the hired thugs, and the solitary rancher making his stand. The wind whispered around them, carrying the scent of pine and an old, primal violence. Raymond broke the silence. With a roar of frustration, he lunged at Nate. It happened in a blur. Nate met the charge not with anger, but with a farmer's solid strength. He didn't throw a punch. He simply absorbed Raymond's momentum and shoved him back with a force that sent the smaller man sprawling in the snow. The two hired hands moved at once. One came at Nate from the side, a knife flashing in his hand. Nate turned, catching the man's wrist and twisting it with a brutal efficiency learned from handling stubborn livestock. The knife clattered to the ground. The second man, seeing his companion in trouble, drew his pistol. He didn't aim it. He just pulled it, a panicked, clumsy movement. In the chaos of the scuffle, as Nate threw the first man aside, the second man stumbled backward. There was a deafening crack that echoed across the silent valley, a sound that ripped the peaceful afternoon to shreds. A woman screamed not Linda, but another voice. Everyone froze. Nate looked up and saw his nearest neighbors, Jed and Martha Riley, standing at the edge of his property line, not 200 yards away. Jed held a hunting rifle, and Martha's face was a pale circle of shock. They must have heard the riders and the shouting and come to investigate. The gunshot had galvanized them. The thug with the pistol looked from the rifle in Jed's hands to Nate's cold, furious face and seemed to realize how badly this had gone. Raymond scrambled to his feet, his face pale, his arrogance replaced by a rat-like cunning. He saw Jed's rifle, saw the grim set of Nate's jaw, and knew the fight was lost. For now. He pointed a trembling finger at Nate. "This isn't over. Callahan, you can't hide behind your fences forever. I'll be back, and I'll have the law with me." He scrambled onto his horse, his two men quickly following suit. They wheeled their mounts around and galloped out of the yard, their retreat as chaotic and ugly as their arrival. Silence descended, thick and heavy. The only sounds were the distant caw of a raven and the soft sobbing coming from the cabin. Jed and Martha hurried over, their faces etched with concern. "Nate, you all right?" Jed asked, his rifle still held at the ready. "I'm fine," Nate said, his eyes never leaving the cabin door. "Thank you, Jed. Your timing was good." "Heard the commotion," Jed said grimly. "Figured you could use a hand." Nate nodded his thanks, then turned and walked to the cabin. He pushed the door open. The scene inside tore at his heart. Linda was huddled on the floor, her body racked with violent, silent sobs. The children were clustered around her, their small faces pale with a terror they couldn't understand. Nal was trying to be brave, her arm around her mother's shoulders, but tears were streaming down her face. Nate knelt in front of her. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before he gently placed it on her shoulder. She flinched, then looked up at him, her eyes a maelstrom of fear and despair. "He'll come back," she whispered, her voice broken. "He'll take them. He'll find a way." The raw terror in her voice was a knife in his gut. All the strength she had shown, all the pride and resilience, had been stripped away, leaving only the primal fear of a mother about to lose her young. She was completely undone. He moved closer, his presence solid and reassuring. He didn't offer empty platitudes or false promises. He offered the only thing he had himself. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her and the children into a circle of protection. She collapsed against his chest, her last defenses crumbling. "If I don't stand with you," he said softly, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer name, "then who will?" Part 7. The judgment of the court and the red mark on the barn door. Raymond Stone was true to his word. A week after his violent retreat, a stoic, weary-looking deputy sheriff rode out to the Hollow Sea Ranch. He carried a summons. A formal petition had been filed in the territorial court in Helena by Mr. Raymond Stone for the immediate return of his legal wife, Linda Stone, and their 4 children, citing desertion and unlawful detainment by one Nathan Callahan. The official paper, with its cold, printed words and authoritative seal, was a more terrifying weapon than any gun. It was the law, impersonal and immense, and it had been twisted into the shape of Raymond's malice. Linda stared at the document, her face losing all color, the fragile peace of the preceding days shattering like glass. The journey to Helena was a somber, 2-day affair. Nate hired a sturdy wagon and outfitted it against the cold, creating a small, warm cocoon for Linda and the children. He left the ranch in the capable hands of Jed and Martha Riley, whose quiet support had become an unspoken pillar of strength. Throughout the long ride, Linda was silent, withdrawn into a place of deep, cold terror. Nate watched her, his heart aching. He had faced down blizzards and charging bulls, but he had no weapon against the crushing weight of a corrupt legal system. All he could offer was his presence, a steady, quiet promise that she was not alone. The courthouse in Helena was an imposing stone building that smelled of old paper, stale cigar smoke, and fear. The courtroom itself was small and stifling, packed with the curious and the idle. Nate had used his money to hire the best lawyer in the territory, a sharp-eyed man named Mr. Davies. But even his reassurances did little to soothe the frantic terror in Linda's eyes. She sat on the hard wooden bench between Nate and Davies, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. Across the room, Raymond sat with his own lawyer, looking confident, almost smug. He was dressed in a new suit, his handsome face arranged in an expression of pained sincerity, the very picture of a wronged husband. The proceedings began. The judge, a man named Patterson with a face like a tired bloodhound and a reputation for being stern but fair, listened impassively as Raymond's lawyer laid out their case. They painted a picture of a flighty, unstable woman who had abandoned her loving husband, stealing his money and his children. It was a masterpiece of fiction, delivered with practiced ease. And then Raymond produced his masterstroke, a marriage certificate, legally filed and stamped, bearing his name and hers. He also produced birth records for Nala and the twins, which listed him as the father. For baby Ruth, there was nothing. But the implication was clear. When the documents were presented to Linda, she could only stare at them. "He made me sign," she whispered, her voice a thread of sound. "I didn't want to, but he—" She trailed off, the memory too painful to voice. The judge looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Stone, is this your signature?" She could only nod, a tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. A palpable wave of despair rolled off her. The law was on his side. The papers were real. Nate reached over and covered her clenched hands with his own, his grip firm and steady, an anchor in the storm. When it was Linda's turn to speak, her testimony was hesitant, broken, guided by Mr. Davies. She spoke of Raymond's neglect, of the hunger and the fear. But she had no proof, only her words against his papers. She spoke of his drinking, his gambling, his long absences. Raymond's lawyer artfully twisted her words, portraying her as a discontented wife, ungrateful for the life her husband provided. Nate felt a murderous rage building in his chest. a desire to leap across the courtroom and throttle the lies in Raymond's throat. But he remained still, his hand a constant, reassuring pressure on Linda's. The case seemed lost. The judge looked grim. He was a man of paper and law, and the paper was all on Raymond's side. He seemed poised to deliver his judgment when Mr. Davies stood up. "Your Honor, the petitioner has established his legal claim, but a legal claim does not always equate to a moral one, or a safe one. We have one final witness." A ripple of surprise went through the courtroom. Davies had told Nate he was searching for anyone who knew the Stones and Helena, but he had given no indication he had succeeded. The bailiff opened a side door, and a small, elderly woman walked slowly into the room. She was bent with age, her face a web of wrinkles, but her eyes were as sharp and bright as a bird's. She introduced herself as Esther May Brown. Raymond, for the first time, lost his composure. A flicker of genuine panic crossed his face. He leaned over and whispered frantically to his lawyer. Esther May Brown had been Raymond and Linda's landlady in Helena a year prior, before Linda had finally fled. In a clear, unwavering voice that cut through the stuffy courtroom air, she began to speak. "That man," she said, pointing a gnarled finger at Raymond, "is a snake in a fancy coat. He calls himself a husband, a father. I saw him. I saw how he treated her. Never a kind word, never a dollar for food, though he always had money for cards and whiskey." Raymond's lawyer leaped to his feet. "Objection, hearsay. The ramblings of a senile old woman." "Sit down, counselor," Judge Patterson grumbled, his tired eyes now wide and focused on Esther. "Let the woman speak." Esther's voice grew stronger, filled with an ancient, righteous anger. "Ramblings? Are they? I'll tell you what I saw with my own eyes. I saw him come home one night, deep in his cups and deeper in debt to a man named Finn. I was sweeping the hall. The door was open. I heard him yelling at her." She paused, her gaze locking with Linda's, a look of shared, painful memory passing between them. He told her he'd found a way to clear his debt. He said Finn had a brother, a miner up in the mountains, whose wife couldn't give him children. He said the man would pay good money, $200, for a strong boy to raise as his own. He tried to take one of the twins. He said one less mouth to feed would be a blessing. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Linda began to sob, not in despair now, but in the agony of a nightmare being dragged into the light. Nate's grip on her hand tightened, his knuckles white. Esther's voice dropped to a low, damning conclusion. "I heard her screaming. I heard her say she would die before she let him sell her child. That's when I burst in with my broomstick and told him I'd already sent for the sheriff. He ran off like the coward he is. She left with the children the very next day. That man doesn't want his children. He wants to sell them." The courtroom was utterly silent. Esther's testimony had landed like a cannonball, shattering Raymond's carefully constructed facade. His face was ashen, his smug confidence replaced by the trapped, desperate look of an animal in a snare. Judge Patterson stared at Raymond for a long, hard minute, his eyes filled with a cold, profound disgust. He didn't need any more testimony. He slammed his gavel down, the sound echoing the finality of a closing coffin lid. "The petition of Mr. Stone is denied," he boomed, his voice filling the room. "Furthermore, on the basis of this testimony, I find him to be an unfit and dangerous parent. Full and sole custody of the children Nala, Leo, Tom, and Ruth is hereby granted to their mother, Linda. This court orders that Raymond Stone is to have no contact with them, ever. Bailiff, see this man out, and sheriff," he added, looking at the lawman in the back of the room. "I suggest you have a long talk with the Mr. Stone about his associate, Mr. Finn." It was over. Raymond, his face a mask of disbelief and pure hatred, was escorted out, his final venomous glare directed not at Linda, but at Nate. The journey back to the ranch was a world away from the one to Helena. A silent, fragile hope filled the wagon. The children, sensing the change in their mother, were giddy with relief. But Linda remained quiet, as if afraid to believe it was real. They arrived home as dusk was falling. As they pulled into the yard, Nate saw it immediately. A section of the pole fence by the main gate was smashed, the timbers broken and thrown aside, and there, on the clean, white-painted wood of the main barn door, scrawled in what looked like red chalk or clay, were 2 words in big, angry letters: "You lose." A cold fury, different from the hot rage of the courtroom, settled over Nate. This was not just an act of vandalism. It was a violation, a threat, a promise that Raymond's hatred would not be bound by a judge's decree. "Martha," Nate said, turning to the neighbor who had come out to greet them. "Take them inside, all of them. Lock the door." Linda's hand flew to her mouth, her newfound peace instantly shattered. "Nate, no. Let him go. It's not worth it." "It is worth it," he said, his voice grim. He looked at her, at the children. "This ends tonight." He didn't take Zeus, he saddled Goliath, the black stallion. His leg, now nearly healed, was faster and had more fight in him. He grabbed his rifle from its scabbard. He looked at the tracks in the snow. They were fresh, leading away from the ranch, toward the Badlands. Raymond was a fool. He had left a clear trail. Nate rode into the twilight, not with the frantic energy of the blizzard, but with a cold, methodical purpose. He was not just a rancher anymore. He was the protector of a family. He followed the tracks for less than an hour before he caught up to him. Raymond was not trying to escape. He was making camp by a small fire, drinking from a bottle, nursing his wounded pride. Nate dismounted, his rifle held loosely in his hands. Raymond scrambled to his feet, his hand going for the pistol at his belt. "Don't!" Nate said, his voice carrying in the still air, flat and devoid of emotion. "It's over." "It's not over till I say it is," Raymond spat, his face ugly in the firelight. "You think you won. You stole my wife. You stole my children." "They were never yours to lose," Nate replied. "You are just a bad debt they were forced to carry. The law's done with you. Now I'm done with you." He didn't need to fire a shot. He didn't need to fight. The sheer, implacable certainty in his eyes was enough. Raymond saw not just a man, but the embodiment of a justice far older than any courthouse. He saw the end of the line. His bravado crumbled. Nate escorted him back to town and delivered him, along with a clear account of the threats and vandalism, to the sheriff. Raymond, his spirit broken, confessed everything. When Nate returned to the ranch, the cabin was alight, a beacon of warmth in the cold. Dark night. He walked inside. The children were asleep. Linda was sitting in the chair by the hearth, waiting for him. She looked up as he entered, her eyes searching his face. He simply nodded. "He's gone. He won't be back." And then she began to cry. Not the frantic, terrified sobs of the past, but a quiet, steady, silent weeping. The tears flowed down her cheeks, washing away years of fear, of shame, of running. They were tears of exhaustion. They were tears of relief. They were the tears of a woman who had finally, after a lifetime of storms, reached a safe harbor. Part 8. The House of Laughter and the Newly Bloomed Love. The winter did not release its grip on Montana easily. It clung to the high passes and shadowed valleys, a stubborn ghost refusing to depart, but eventually, inevitably, the Chinook winds began to blow, warm and soft. A promise whispered from the west. The great, monolithic drifts of snow began to shrink, weeping their melt into the awakening earth. The creeks, locked in ice for months, began to sing again. The gray, somber silence of winter was replaced by a symphony of drips and trickles, the caw of returning crows, and the sweet, piercing song of the meadowlark. But at the Hollow Sea Ranch, The truest sign of spring was not the green shoots pushing through the mud or the softened sky. It was the sound of laughter. It was a sound so alien to the property that at first it felt like a dream. It spilled from the cabin in the morning, echoed in the yard during the day, and settled into soft murmurs by the fire at night. It was the sound of Leo and Tom discovering that a patch of mud could be a magnificent battlefield for stick soldiers. It was the sound of Naal's delighted gasp when Goliath, his leg now strong and sound, nudged her hand with his soft nose, asking for a treat. It was the sound of baby Ruth's happy gurgles as she lay on a blanket in a patch of warm spring sun. The house Nate had built for a ghost was now, finally, a home. One bright morning, Nate was out by the main barn, replacing a section of the door that had been scarred by Raymond's angry red scrawl. He worked with the steady, practiced rhythm of a man who knew his tools. He was no longer just going through the motions, using labor to exhaust his mind. There was a purpose to his work now, a sense of building, of renewing. Linda was there with him. She wasn't his hired hand anymore. That pretense had evaporated in the fire of the blizzard and the trial. She was his partner. She stood on the other side of the door, holding the heavy plank steady while he hammered the nails home. They worked in a comfortable, easy silence, their movements synchronized, a language of shared tasks that was more intimate than any words. Her face, once a pale mask of fear and hardship, had a soft color in it now. The constant, hunted look in her eyes had been replaced by a quiet, watchful peace. She would smile, a small, shy thing that transformed her entire face, whenever she looked over at her children playing in the yard. Nate paused, lowering his hammer, and just watched. He watched the boys tumbling over each other in a patch of new grass. He watched Naal carefully trying to braid a piece of twine, her brow furrowed in concentration. He watched the sunlight catch the fine, soft hair on Ruth's head. And he looked at Linda, her hands, once chapped and raw, now softened, holding his barn door steady. A profound realization washed over him, as clear and bright as the spring morning itself. He remembered the notice he had tacked up in town, a desperate plea from a lonely, broken man. He had offered $1 a day for someone to muck out his stalls and sweep his floors. It had been a simple transaction, a means to an end. He had paid her to clean his cabin, but what she had really cleaned was the thick, settled dust on his heart. She and her children had swept out the silent, grieving ghosts and filled every empty corner with a vibrant, chaotic, beautiful life he had thought was lost to him forever. He looked at his 1,000 acres, his strong fences, his healthy cattle. He had once measured his wealth by these things. He now knew how poor he had been. He had been a king ruling over a dead and silent kingdom. His true fortune was standing right here in his yard, playing in the mud and holding his barn door. Linda seemed to feel his gaze. She looked up from her task, her moss-green eyes meeting his. She saw the change in his expression, the depth of emotion there, and her own gaze softened. "It's a good, solid door," she said, her voice quiet. "It's a good, solid home," he replied, and the words meant more than just the wood and nails. They finished the repair and stood back to admire their work. The ugly red letters were gone, covered by a fresh, strong plank. A scar remained, but it was a reminder not of a threat, but of a battle won. Linda wiped her hands on her apron and looked over at the children. Nate saw a familiar shadow cross her face, not of fear, but of a deep, maternal contemplation. "Nate," she began, her voice hesitant, as if she were testing the weight of the words before she spoke them. She didn't look at him, but kept her eyes fixed on the children. "I've been thinking." He waited, giving her the time she needed. "They're happy here," she continued, a note of wonder in her voice. "They're safe. They're eating well. Tom hasn't coughed once since the spring came." She took a deep breath. They deserve a proper name, a good name, a name that sounds like this place. Strong, safe. She finally turned to look at him, her eyes searching his face, her soul laid bare in their depths. There was no artifice, no coquetry, just a raw, honest vulnerability. If you wouldn't mind it, she said, her voice barely a whisper, I would like for them to take the Callahan name. It was not a proposal born of romance, but of something far deeper. It was a plea for belonging, for permanence. It was a request to graft her small, battered family tree onto his strong, solitary oak. It was the ultimate act of trust from a woman who had learned that trust was the most dangerous currency in the world. Nate felt his heart swell in his chest, a feeling so full and powerful it almost took his breath away. He had been waiting for this, hoping for it, dreaming of it in the quiet hours of the night. He reached out and took her hand. It was small and warm in his large, calloused one. A slow smile spread across his weathered face, erasing the last of the sad, hard lines around his eyes. He looked from her beautiful, earnest face to the 4 precious children who were her entire world, and who had become his. Linda, he said, his voice thick with an emotion that had been buried for 2 long years. He paused, correcting himself, the truth of it settling over him like the warm spring sun. He squeezed her hand. Welcome home, Linda Callahan. Her answering smile was like the dawn. And so, on the high plains of Montana, a house that had been empty was filled, a heart that had been closed was opened. A man who thought he had lost everything found that his life was just beginning. And a woman who had nothing but her dignity found that she had possessed the greatest treasure all along. The fire in the hearth burned brighter than ever, no longer a solitary defense against the cold, but the warm, beating heart of a family. Its light a testament to the simple, profound truth that justice and compassion are 2 sides of the same coin, and that the greatest acts of love are often born not of passion, but of a quiet, steady belief in the goodness of another human soul. Thank you for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you are all tuning in from, so please leave a comment below to connect and share your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel, Wild West Night, like this video, and give it a little extra love by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.